Hi, I'm Catherine Riggs, and this is Hard Work Doesn't Win Grants, the show for local government and nonprofit teams pursuing serious grant funding. We break down the strategy, systems, and compliance that turn readiness into real dollars, because hard work doesn't win grants, readiness does. If you are a local government, a nonprofit, a school district, or a tribe and you receive federal funding, you may have noticed that grant headlines lately have you wondering whether or not your indirect cost rate is in trouble. Every so often, a headline goes around saying that federal indirect cost rates are being cut. Overhead is being capped, lower rates are coming. The headline rarely says whose rates are being capped, and that's the whole problem, because the answer to whose rates changes everything. Let me first explain what an indirect cost rate is, what actually formulates it, and why a headline about grants can be completely accurate and still have nothing to do with you or your organization. What is an indirect cost rate? When you run a federally funded grant program, some costs are easy to tie to the work. The direct salaries of a person doing the project work, the supplies that are used, the travel that's taken, all of those are direct costs. Other costs keep the whole organization running, including personnel and buildings and all kinds of things that are needed to run these grant programs. But the costs don't attach directly to any single grant. Those are the electric bill, the rent, the accounting team, the HR department, the people who keep you compliant. Those are indirect costs. You cannot invoice a grant line by line for a share of the electric bill. And an indirect cost rate uses a percentage of the overall annual expenditures instead. So your indirect cost rate is a percentage that gets applied to the defined base of your direct costs. And it lets you recover a fair share of that overhead from the grants that you are running. If your negotiated rate is 30%, then for every dollar of direct cost that's in your base, you recover 30 cents towards the overhead costs that make that work possible. This rate is not padding. It's how an organization keeps the lights on while delivering federally funded work. Without it, every grant would quietly drain the general operating budget for organizations, and those organizations least able to absorb that loss are the ones that would feel it first. This is also why most common questions that are asked from nonprofit organizations are, why don't grants pay for salaries? They pay for projects, but they don't pay for our overall salaries. And the most common answer is that grants should be unrestricted, or there should be more grants for overhead or general operating support. But the answer is not more grants for different things. The answer lies in indirect costs versus direct cost. Having said that's advocacy for a different funding mechanism that is found in different types of grants that are not federal grants. That is another story for another time. So let us get back to federal grants. And another aside, I do want to say that the term overhead and indirect rates are often used interchangeably, and they're very different things. But for the context here, we will use them synonymously. 3 things that impact your rate at the federal level. Once you understand that rates exist to recover real overhead, it's easier to see what actually changes it. 3 forces are in play, and they operate at different levels. The first is the regulation. Indirect cost rates are governed by 2 CFR 200. It's the government-wide rule book for federal grants. You may have seen a lot of headlines about that in the news recently as well. It's the framework for every kind of recipient, any kind of recipient for a federal grant. And it's where 2 paths for an indirect cost rate live. You either negotiate a rate with your cognizant federal agency, or you elect to take the de minimis rate, which in the 2024 revision of 2 CFR 200, it raised that de minimis rate to 15% of your modified total direct cost base, up from 10%. The regulation applies to everyone who touches federal money in any way, shape, or form. The second impact to your indirect rate is your own cost structures. Whether you negotiate or take the de minimis rate, the number reflects your organization. A capital-heavy agency with a large administrative footprint carries a different indirect rate than an organization that provides mostly direct project work. Your rate is built from your actual costs at the level of your whole organizational entity. And it's why two organizations doing very similar work can hold very different rates. And the third impact to your indirect rates is the funding stream. And this is the one that most people miss. It's the ones that carry the headlines, and it's where a lot of confusion comes in. Individual programs and agencies can carry their own rules about indirect costs. Some federal statutes cap the rate for a specific program. Sub-agencies have tried to set their own ceilings, and this means that the rate you can actually recover depends not only on the regulation and your own costs, but on where the money comes from and what Congress and the agency have said about it. This is why the headlines can get skewed. Grants do not go to one kind of place. They go to institutions of higher education, to cities and counties, state governments, school district, regional and quasi-governmental entities, transit authorities, nonprofits of every size, and to tribal governments and tribal organizations. They fund an enormous range of purposes, from biomedical research to road maintenance, to the Head Start program where your neighborhood children may go, to water systems and workforce training. And all of the recipients of all of these different federal grant programs hold indirect cost rates. All of them live under the same regulation, but their rates, their funding streams, and their political exposure are completely different. When a headline says indirects are being cut, it's almost never talking about all indirect cost rates for every organization. It's usually talking about one funding stream, and when the reporting fills in the impact for whatever audience that particular reporting outlet serves. So a story written for the research world explains that a cap is set on indirect rates, but it means that cap is for a specific type of funding, primarily focused on universities. A story written for hospitals explains it's for the academic medical centers. A headline stays broad and general because grants is a broad and general term. But the substance underneath those headlines is fairly narrow. That's exactly how the recent lower indirect rate story works. Trace it to the source, and it's all about research funding at institutions of higher education, driven through the agencies that fund university research. Most specifically, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. Universities hold negotiated research rates, or negotiated indirect cost rates for these types of research programs that commonly run at 50 to 70%. And the fight is forcing those rates down towards the 15% de minimis. And this is a real fight with real consequences for higher education. But it's simply not a fight about the rate at a county, a school district, a tribal organization, or a service-oriented nonprofit. It's not about how they negotiate their rates at their cognizant agencies, and it's not about their funding. Even if your organization's cognizant agency is Department of Health and Human Services, NIH is a sub-agency of DHHS, and the particular indirect cost rate focus is on research grant funding from NIH. If your organization runs or it's near the de minimis rate, or you hold a modest negotiated rate for non-research grant funded work, then this story just doesn't affect you. The regulation that governs your rate has not been rewritten, and it's not going to lower it. While all of 2 CFR 200 affects your grants and your indirect rates, the de minimis rate, which was moved up under the 2024 revision, and the rule that a pass-through grant or pass-through organization cannot force you below the indirect rate that you are entitled to. Both of those key provisions in 2 CFR 200 still stand. And the most recent proposed changes this summer to 2 CFR 200, all 412 pages of it, did not even touch indirect cost rates. So the takeaway from all of this is that a grant headline is a headline about a line item in one section of one agency's appropriations. Before you apply a grants headline to your whole organization, ask a simple question. Whose funding does this story actually describe? And is it mine? Most of the time, the alarming version of the story is describing a corner of the grant world that looks nothing like yours. Knowing which corner and knowing what your rate is built from under your own cost structures is something that really helps you read the news and read it calmly instead of bracing for a cut that was never aimed at you. If you're working through your own indirect cost position, whether to take the de minimis rate or to negotiate a NICRA and what your rate actually should recover, the grant project does this work with local governments and nonprofits. You don't have to start from a blank page. If you want to understand how NICRAs are constructed, we also have guides available for that. What I'm watching next is the indirect cost fight for research grants and institutions of higher education. This fight is not over, and how it resolves in the next appropriation cycles will tell us a lot about how far this administration is willing to push and how firmly Congress will hold that line. Last year's appropriations actually reversed agency guidance and held indirect rates for certain agencies. I'll be keeping track of it, and I will keep drawing the line clearly between the part that affects higher education and the part that impacts the rest of us.